Thanks, everyone. We might get started with the session today, and I'm sure a few more will join as we go on. But I'll start by handing over to Elin Vronsky to introduce us.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar entitled Exploring Downstream Due Diligence, Current Company Practices, which is hosted today by the Global Business Initiative for Human Rights and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Please note that this webinar is being recorded today. We'll have about an hour, and you'll have a chance as participants to put in questions through the chat function. Please remember to stay muted and raise your hand in case you would like to ask a question to the panel. So, as we know, since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles back in 2011, it has been made clear that businesses need to respect human rights through conducting human rights due diligence, and that they need to address their impacts across all of their activities and business relationships. However, while there has been a lot of progress in looking at what business can do in their supply chain, there has been maybe a bit less attention to what happens in what we call the downstream. But obviously, business can impact on human rights across all parts of the value chain, from the procurement of goods and services, the manufacturing of goods, to which is called the upstream, to the way in which their own products and services are marketed, sold, and used by other businesses, state actors, or consumers in the downstream. The Global Business Initiative on Human Rights and the Danish Institute have each recently developed and published resources to further clarify expectations and provide concrete guidance and examples on how to conduct downstream human rights due diligence. These resources serve to demonstrate how downstream due diligence is indeed already being conducted as an integral part of the human rights due diligence of company. So during this online session, we will hear about these two resources, as well as from three companies, namely Novo Nordisk, Reckitt, and Pandora, on how they are conducting human rights due diligence in their downstream activities. So without further ado, I will give over to Ben Hogan from the Global Business Initiative to introduce the new resource that you recently published. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Elin, and it's really great to join you all today, and indeed to see so many of you on the line. The Global Business Initiative on Human Rights is a member-led organisation, multinational corporations across diverse sectors, and focused on advancing corporate respect for human rights through peer learning and global engagement. We've had a working group on this topic of downstream due diligence focused in for the past 2 years or so on questions related to this area of practice, and particularly as it pertains to the use and misuse of products and services, and in relation to the identification of risks related to customers and end users. We were delighted to publish a report on this work earlier this month entitled Effective Downstream Human Rights Due Diligence, Key Questions for Companies. And that report does exactly what the title says. It aims to set out some key questions for companies that have emerged from our conversations on this topic with our members and other companies. I'll give the usual caveat. The views presented in the report are those of GBI and do not necessarily represent those of our member companies. But I'd like to dive in to talk very briefly about some of the content you'll find within that report. And if we could have the first slide, please, that would be great. So first, I think it's important to set some context and really to add emphasis to Elin's opening remarks in that there are clear expectations from international standards, and a risk-based approach that follows the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises must necessarily cover the entirety of a company's value chain. That is the expectation that is set out within those international standards. It may, of course, be the case that risks for a given company will be of greatest magnitude in the supply chain, that is to say, upstream context. And of course, the UN Guiding Principles provide for the prioritization of the addressing of risk where that is necessary. But that isn't a get out of jail free clause, so to speak. There nevertheless is an expectation that companies would turn to address less severe risks over time, perhaps reflective of why this has become a topic that has seen additional focus now 12 years on from the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles. And it's also not to say that risks downstream can't be the most severe that a company may face. In some cases, indeed, they are. And that's the second point I want to highlight here, which is that companies are already being held accountable before national courts and before OECD national contact points for responsible business conduct. And the report makes reference to a number of such cases. One set of examples that resonate for many are the settlements that have been reached with companies in the United States in relation to the devastating opioid epidemic in that country. The settlements there, and the cases have not by and large gone to trial, so they are settlements, are interesting in that they do include a whole range of businesses. So sure, there are the drug manufacturers who produce the opioids and knew of the potential impacts. But there have also been settlements reached with pharmacies who knew or ought to have known about the risks to the right to health and life caused by sustained growth in sales of an addictive product that in some cases was being illegally prescribed in massive quantities within their communities. And somewhat interestingly, there have also been settlements with professional services firms, such as management consultants, that were hired to develop sales strategies to boost the sales of the drugs and were aware of the risks to people of doing so. So this is really something that affects companies in all sectors and not just consumer-facing industries. And I think that's worth highlighting and something we set out in the chapeau to the report. If we can turn to the next slide then, our report sets out key questions in terms of how to approach downstream human rights due diligence. And our objective is to prompt practitioners to think about where and with whom risks may be identified and addressed. It takes as its starting point the fact that human rights due diligence looks the same upstream and downstream, but the tools that you may use to identify risks and the groups of stakeholders, both internal and external, may look different by necessity of the context. Our key questions are broken down into 4 groups. We consider 2 aspects to risk identification. First, those risks that arise in relation to the product, service, and business model. And second, those that arise in relation to the end user or the end use case of a product or service, and risks from the customer in question, as well as any other downstream business partners. I include a third bullet point here, just to highlight that this isn't necessarily exhaustive. There are other downstream risks which we don't focus on detail in this report, for example, in relation to transport and logistics, which are nevertheless important, but perhaps more clearly understood by existing human rights due diligence in supply chain contexts. The questions then move to consider how companies can take steps to prevent and mitigate downstream risks. And the key message here is that this does not necessarily require reinventing the wheel. The report contains examples of how companies can build on existing processes, such as know your customer checks or sanction screening within customer relationship management software, to embed elements of downstream due diligence in processes and in governance structures. And we'll hear some company examples on today's webinar, so I'll not go into any more detail there. We also emphasize that mitigation should begin from the outset in terms of the design of products or services, or the provision of advice, for example, in the case of professional services contexts. And thinking through those risks and how they may be mitigated from the outset helps identify opportunities for that mitigation. And that's a key point in terms of the approach downstream for many industries. In terms of opportunities to exercise leverage, this we thought would be a particular challenge, and it is true to say that it may be more difficult than in the supply chain, but we've learned that it's not necessarily a barrier. Yes, it's more challenging. Relationships with customers are different to those with suppliers by their very nature, but in global value chains, we often find that it's the case that customers may also be suppliers, particularly for multinational enterprises. And there may be opportunities to exercise leverage across that relationship in a sort of feedback loop. We also heard examples of how companies have used further sales, service, and aftercare as a basis for leverage. And we heard about how companies are using contractual negotiations to align expectations in some cases providing capacity building to support customers who have an interest in addressing these risks to ensure market access for their own products. So really thinking creatively about leverage and not solely as a commercial leverage context, I think is relevant in this context. Finally, we address tracking and effectiveness and communication. And the key there is that those aspects are considered from the outset so that they can be considered at the right junctures throughout. Final slide then, I just encourage you to download the report and review the 20 key questions for yourself. You can find out more about this work on our website, gbihr.org. And we've posted a link, I think, in the chat to our work here. Happy to take questions later, or indeed do feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ben, and indeed the link to the report is included in the chat already, so I do encourage participants to go and look it up. And thank you for reminding us also of the fact that human rights due diligence being in the downstream or the upstream will have to be context specific, both to the company and what it produces or sells, but also to where it is operating. So there's a lot to learn there. And I think, really interesting to hear about the peer dialogues you've been having around this topic. So to get us further on the topic, I would like to hand over to Gabrielle Holy from the Danish Institute, who will let us know a little bit more about the content of this publication with case studies. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Great, thanks so much, Elin. And thank you, Ben, for that great succinct account of the issues at stake here. We're very pleased to learn that GBI was also working on this agenda, and I'm equally pleased to say that I think our two publications are very complementary. I think Ben's and GBI's work focuses, as Ben noted, on kind of key questions for companies, whereas our publication presents a number of case studies of companies who are already conducting due diligence in the downstream with, I think, a degree of specificity about how they're going about that. Like GBI, the Human Rights and Business team at the Danish Institute has been working on downstream issues for some time, and we recognise that although there are clear expectations in the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines that companies undertake due diligence across the value chain, to date, as Elin noted, much more work has been done in respect of impacts that arise in the supply chain. And there's a general lack of guidance for companies on expectations of human rights due diligence in the downstream part of the value chain. Nonetheless, we're not starting from scratch here. There are, of course, more developed practices in certain sectors which are acknowledged to have higher risks of severe impacts in the downstream, such as tech. And equally, there are widely used processes that may not be currently addressed specifically at human rights impacts, but that can nonetheless be leveraged. So we held a closed roundtable for business in October last year as a space for peer learning and exchange, and a number of companies participating expressed a degree of frustration at the lack of clear guidance and the utility of learning from each other. And so we developed these case studies in the report as a means of continuing that good conversation. So the publication contains case studies from companies across a range of sectors and contexts, from consumer goods to pharma to tech to renewable energy to transport and logistics, to provide an example of end-of-life disposal. What we aim to do in the publication is demystify some of the core concepts, covering, of course, what the main international frameworks expect and trends in regulation, what kinds of human rights impacts are likely to arise in the downstream, as well as emerging practices for addressing them in order to present the case studies in their proper context. But we really wanted the case studies to speak for themselves, and we're very grateful to the companies who provided them and their openness in sharing how they do this. We've tried to present a fair assessment of what it means to do due diligence in the downstream, acknowledging that conversations around due diligence in this part of the value chain are at an earlier stage than those around the supply chain. And we don't shy away from acknowledging that there are some challenges here, that the kinds of human rights impacts that might be found in the downstream part of the value chain might be broader than those typically considered in the context of the supply chain, necessitating companies to consider not only labour rights risks, but a broader spectrum of risks to human rights. And this, of course, necessitates a different approach to the conduct of downstream due diligence to that in the upstream. But what I think these case studies show is that it's possible and that there are a number of existing very familiar processes that can be adapted to consider human rights impacts. And this includes responsible sales, know your customer, and anti-bribery and corruption checks. And we'll hear more about that from Novo Nordisk in a moment. Responsible marketing practices, and we'll hear about that from Pandora, as well as the potential for full value chain human rights impact assessments to help identify what impacts arise in the downstream and devise actions to address them. And we'll hear more about that from Rekha in a moment. So this is becoming ordinary course of business. And what we really need to do is escalate efforts here to scale these emerging good practices. And what this means is developing a means for companies to learn from each other, but critically, supporting these efforts by clear authoritative guidance, which should include coherent regulation. I should note that a number of the companies who provided us with case studies, as well as others who participated in the roundtable that we held last year, noted that the full value chain approach taken by the Commission in the proposal for a corporate sustainability due diligence directive did act as a driver to help them secure internal buy-in to escalate efforts. And this is momentum that should be harnessed rather than discouraged. I'll stop there to make sure we have ample time to hear directly from Novo Nordisk, Pandora, and Reckitt, three quite different companies in different sectors who will share how they do downstream due diligence. So with that, I'll hand over to Caroline to speak for Novo Nordisk. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to share what we're doing in this space at Novo Nordisk. So very quickly, my name is Caroline, and I'm a senior compliance counsel at Novo Nordisk. And I joined this company only 4 months ago. But before Novo Nordisk, I was actually at Epimola Maersk, where I held different positions in the compliance department as well. And then I was very shortly at a very large German company called BASF, where I was exposed to actually the German Supply Chain DD Act. So what are we doing at Novo Nordisk? Could you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, before we dig into it, I just wanted to give you a very quick glimpse of Novo Nordisk. We are operating in 80 affiliates across the globe. You can see that we are 50,000 plus employees. We are growing at a really, really rapid pace. We are the 6th largest pharmaceutical company in the world, and we supply over 50% of diabetes insulin medicine across the globe. Next slide, please. So yeah, I don't think you can really say it, but I just wanted to sort of give a little bit of a journey of the human rights maturity level here at Novo Nordisk and where we started from. So we've always been on a human rights journey in this company, even before, of course, the directives that are sort of coming our way, started into discussions, right? So between 2011 and 2018, we had built a human rights practice, and that at that time it was in the corporate sustainability and commercial department. And then in 2018, that function was actually moved to the business ethics compliance office. That's where I'm sitting right now. So Novo Nordisk has been very, very active in terms of recognizing human rights impacts, both for its employees, obviously internally, as well as related to its relations with third parties and the communities. So what are we doing in this space? I think, like many other companies out there that are also using their current processes, their current third-party management processes, we at Novo Nordisk just decided that it's much easier to expand the current processes we have to build on the human rights aspect, right? So we decided to enhance our global third-party management processes and sort of build it up so that we can capture these human rights due diligences and so that we can also report on them. It's also good to know that we also started from a risk assessment perspective. Back in 2021, Novo Nordisk did a risk assessment across its value chain, actually. So for us, it's not only the downstream impact, it's all through the value chain, upstream, downstream, and we assessed the human rights impacts to ensure that we can actually identify and mitigate and prevent whatever we saw through this risk assessment. And out of this risk assessment process that was done, we identified some salient human rights risks, for example. Generally, there would be affordability of medicines to our patients, patient safety, and as well as, of course, human rights impacts in the business relationship to the third-party representatives, right? Patient safety, for example, is something that is managed in a whole different department, in our pharmacovigilance department. So we have a system whereby patients can report safety concerns, and that is investigated and taken care of. And so that's something that's also done outside of the third-party risks management system, for example. But it's a way that we can also ensure that the impacts of our medicines and the products downwards to our patients and our patients actually is seen and sort of mitigated. So in order to address this impact, of course, in upstream and downstream, we have designed our system where we do the third-party management for anti-corruption risks and bribery risks to actually add on human rights related questions into the questionnaire, right? So we want to ensure that our potential business partners are also assessed on any sort of impacts of human rights that they've had on their own practices, on their own business. And if we see red flags, one of the mitigating actions we do is contractual basis, whereby we ensure that, they either come up to practice on human rights, or we also do capacity building with them so that they can come up to speed and come up to standards with the act and as the act is supposed to be enforced. So right now we are in the processes of actually rolling out this third-party due diligence human rights process. We're going to do education. We are actually working very, very closely with our sustainability office, with our responsible sourcing department as well. And there will be training coming. So we're going to build training to ensure that everybody in the company knows how to assess the risks, of course, and how to sort of discuss them and teach them in the organization. As we all know, generally, a lot of these risks are seen in the local business, in the local area. So for example, in China or in Brazil or in Russia. So it's our job in the corporate headquarters as the Center of Excellence to ensure that our local business partners are really educated in how to assess these risks and how to bring them up so that we can see them and mitigate them appropriately from a corporate level. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Caroline. And really great to sort of hear how you're able to adapt to existing processes to address these kinds of risks. Now I'll hand over to Johanna to hear from Pandora about your approach to responsible marketing.
Thank you, and hi everyone. I was going to say good morning, but it's not. I think it's more 11:30, isn't it? So maybe that's not sufficient, but it's really nice to be here today. As mentioned, my name is Johanna and I'm part of Pandora's global sustainability team, but on a daily basis, I'm driving our responsible marketing practices. And just to kick it off, I just wanted to paint a picture of what company Pandora really is. And Pandora is the world's largest jewelry brand. And what do we really mean with that? That is to say that Pandora is known by more customers and crafting more jewelry than any other brand in the industry today. And every day we obviously interact with millions of fans and people around the world. And in 2022, we actually have over 600 million visits to our physical and online stores, which is quite some staggering numbers. And obviously with that comes a responsibility as well. And that's what I'm here to talk a little bit more about, our responsible marketing practices. So maybe we can move to the next slide. Great, thank you so much. So this is really a short sort of condensed version of what we are really talking about in the case that you can read further in the report that was just published. Obviously, as you see, as many other companies, we started off with conducting a human rights impact assessment, and I think that was back in 2021. And really what we did was that it helped us shed light on sort of risks, salient risk we had for upstream, but mostly then in this context, downstream, our supply chains. And really what we saw was that, to no surprise, obviously, we have a huge impact where we meet and interact with our customers. and especially then in our advertising practices. And this sort of work enables us to shed light on the importance of actually formalizing a responsible marketing agenda, because it could be a little bit more sort of on goodwill practices previously, but we saw a need to really formalize this. And I've sort of split up my presentation here in phase 1 and phase 2. And as you can see in the upper side of this slide, we really sort of wanted to sit down and look to making sure that we had appropriate processes and standards in place. And firstly, then we created a standard, which we call our responsible marketing standard, which encompasses various bits and pieces of responsible marketing practices. But really, it goes all the way through ensuring inclusive and diverse marketing practices, children's rights in our marketing practices, but obviously also, for example, how we interact with various type of platforms and how we don't interact with our consumers on platforms that, for example, are present or are giving explicit materials. So firstly, we created a standard. Secondly, we looked to our processes, and that was really about making sure that we have a sort of what we call a campaign compliance process. And that means that we have a lot of different functions. So that is legal, risk, and global sustainability that are helping to consult our marketing department throughout creating these assets or campaigns, if you say. And lastly, and last but not least, obviously the governance piece, which is about ownership as well. And we established our first responsible marketing committee, which reports up to our sustainability board, but is also a body where we could basically go and discuss if we have issues, if we see that things needs to improve. But this is also the committee that oversees the standard that we implemented. But as I said, we implemented a standard, but we all know that obviously it's not only about having a standard in place. It's actually about making sure that that's embedded and implemented throughout our business. So phase 2, which I call the implementation phase, is really where we are today. And, you know, it's really about ensuring that we live by the principles that we have set out. So implementing responsible marketing practices throughout our value chain can, of course, pose challenges, and we are very honest with about that. And that is basically giving the enormous amount of platforms where our marketing material appears. It's a very complex world. We all know that the internet is very big. And one then example of where we are practicing sort of these implementation and due diligence is around our online advertising space and trying to control that and understand where our ads appear. And that is to say then that we are in a mapping phase right now, but we are also integrating sort of KYC or sustainability requirements into our tenders on these suppliers, which has historically not happened. And furthermore, we are, for example, also looking to a screening system where we are looking to ad placements. So this is really to understand the landscape that we operate in, but also to be able to do our proper due diligence in this space. And maybe last but not least, also worth mentioning here is really on the capacity building, because we really need to ensure that we are building capacity and empower internally, and also empowering all our colleagues to be sort of responsible marketing champions. And this is really for us to make sure that we raise awareness of potential downstream impacts in general, and that we have people around the company who can help address these issues. So maybe just to sum it up as well, I know that I don't have too much time today, but we can maybe switch to the last slide. And this is really just to, let's see here, if that appears on the screen. I can't really see it yet, but there we go. Just a couple of key takeaways from our side is really, firstly, understand that this is a complex space we are working in, and it can pose challenges, but it doesn't mean that we need to give up. This is just a sort of an exciting challenge for us, obviously knowing that these platforms are really important in ensuring responsible marketing practices. And secondly, I think that some of the key takeaways is also the power of leveraging the skills around our business, help guide these practices, but also interact with your colleagues and make sure that you empower them to sort of address these challenges within their space and their expertise. And thirdly, dialogue, again, not only internally, but also with stakeholders, such as the one sitting around the table here today. But also we see that the regulatory framework and the progress around due diligence has really helped us to shed light on the importance of sort of formalizing these practices. So that's also sort of an encouragement that this is about making sure that the agenda is moving along the right way. So this was everything from on my side. I know that I think we have David on the line after this, but so maybe I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Johanna. I think it's a really interesting example, and I think one that doesn't always spring to mind immediately when we think about downstream human rights impacts and the importance of taking a responsible approach to marketing. So I think it's a really valuable input you've given. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand over to David from Reckitt. So please go ahead, David. You have the floor.
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thank you very much once again for the invitation to come and share the work that we're doing here at Reckitt. So, brief introduction to myself. So, I'm David Pettit. I'm the Global Human Rights and Sustainable Supply Chain Director at Reckitt. For those who don't know who Reckitt is a global health, hygiene, and nutrition company driven by our purpose to protect, heal, and nurture in the relentless pursuit of a cleaner, healthier world. We have operations in over 62 countries, sales in around 120 countries. And we're a sort of house of many household favorites, such as Durex condoms, Dettol, So, through to Harpic, Finish, Vanish, and breast milk substitutes such as Enfa. So, as a company with the purpose that we have, it's intrinsically important that we do everything that we can in order to enable a healthy environment and also fairer society. And as a result, central to this is ensuring that human rights are respected across our entire value chain. And as a result, what we need to do within the key markets in which we operate is really understand, where are the potential adverse human rights impacts that we, from a UNGP and risk perspective, need to address. But also, due to the nature of some of our brands and the business that we have, where are the potential opportunities where we can positively promote specific human rights? So it's that lens through risk management, but also opportunity, that we're approaching that wider value chain human rights due diligence approach. So when we take our approach, it's still fairly new, if I'm honest. We've got very robust supply chain business partner monitoring programs in place, reporting, engagement, that's all in place. But when you look at the brand's downstream impacts, that's still very much in its early stages. And at the moment, it is very much centered around the human rights impact assessments. That said, we're starting to think around, how do we evolve that to also look at more formal channels to ensure downstream due diligence. Don't forget, if you look at the back of a condom packet or a Harpic toilet cleaner bleach, there is a healthcare line on every single package. That could be a really effective mechanism if we engage more with our consumer relations team around ensuring a human rights lens to the cases that we get reported through that. So that's sort of the activity that we're looking at exploring further as we move forward in terms of how we more formally integrate human rights due diligence into the downstream piece. But let me use Thailand and the human rights impact assessment as an example to sort of bring to life what we've already done. So at the end of 2019, we did our first human rights impact assessment. We decided to focus at the entire brand value chain of two brands within Thailand, Durex condoms and Enfa infant food formula. The reason we chose Thailand was it's one of our top 10 markets. We wanted to focus on Durex because the latex is tapped in Thailand. We manufacture about 40% of condoms for the world, 40% of our Durex brands out of our own factory in Thailand. And then also when you look at the downstream impacts, so the sexual health and reproductive rights element within Thailand is a key risk and opportunity for us given the nature of our business at that point. When we look at Enfa, infant food formula, that was a risk to us, obviously through the sales and marketing of infant food formula. So as a result, when we skip down to the downstream impacts, the Danish Institute, who conducted the assessment on our behalf, applied AAAQ criteria in terms of understanding the impacts of Durex condoms. So that was looking at the availability, the acceptability, the accessibility, and finally the quality of Durex condoms. And as a result, we've identified a range of issues. Key thing in terms of acceptability is around the cultural stigma associated with sex. There was a piece around availability, particularly in the more rural locations of Thailand, whether or not they have access to condoms. And then finally, there was a piece around accessibility in terms of price point, in terms of those that are sort of on the lower economic demographic, how they can purchase condoms. As a result, we've been partnering over the last sort of 2 years with the Durex brand at a global level and a local level. At the global level, we partnered with them to help them integrate a human rights lens into their global brand strategy. And as a result, the Durex brand purpose is all centered around unleashing freedom to be your true sexual self, as we really focus as a business and brand on how we equip, educate, and liberate our consumers, focusing on breaking down cultural barriers and the lack of access, key issues identified in Thailand. How we promote inclusive education around sex and condoms. And then finally, around reframing how sexuality is depicted in culture. So this is really an example how we've embedded and helped shape a brand strategy around addressing some of those fundamental downstream human rights risks. Within Thailand specifically, and again, you can read a little more around this in our case study, underneath this overall brand strategy, the local team have established collaborative partnerships with the UNFPA and with the Thai Ministry of Public Health to promote condoms and modern contraception accessibility through education within schools. We've partnered with Bangkok Pride, again, to promote and educate consumers, in addition to retailers around condom use. We've also leveraged our significant social media presence, again, to highlight inequalities within the space of sex in order to sort of promote greater equality when it comes to it. And then in order to address the accessibility piece around price points, the local team launched a new SKU of condom focused on a lower price point. So that's an example of which we were able to really help shape our Durex brand strategy and then implement locally to address those fundamental issues identified through the HRA. Finally, ENFA. This is a bit more, I would say, less of an opportunity space and more of a sort of obviously risk management positioning, given the obvious sensitivities around breast milk substitutes. But to start with, we as a company always hold that breast is best. However, we recognize that there are circumstances where mothers cannot breastfeed their children for a number of reasons, being lactation challenges, be it nutritional intolerances of the child. And as a result, we need to ensure that we have products in place that enable mothers to gain access to an alternative. However, obviously, the key risks around us within the space is ensuring that we market and advertise our products in a responsible way. And as a result, and unsurprisingly, the HRA identified this risk. And over the last couple of years, we've been working very closely with the Thai business to make a number of enhancements to increase the engagement we're having with those downstream around their responsible marketing practices. We've enhanced our compliance monitoring and communication practices around that. So specifically, we've engaged healthcare professionals to make sure that they are aware of responsible marketing practices in their engagement with potential mothers. We've risk assessed all of our traditional bricks and mortar retailers to identify which are potentially high risk and conducted physical on-site audits of those retailers to ensure compliance with Reckitt's breast milk substitute policy and the local Thai milk code. We've also partnered with the Thai Pediatric Nutrition Manufacturers Association, or the PNMA, to develop an e-learning module for the entire business to help educate them around. So in effect, they have been some of the key engagements that we've done around that space. But obviously, there's a lot more that we can do moving forward. So with that, I would like to hand over to Elin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, Johanna, and Caroline, for these three case studies that I'm sure can inspire a lot of questions. And actually, we already have a few in the chat. So I'll try to distribute these to the panelists and also invite other participants to put in additional questions. So maybe to start with you, Johanna, there were a few questions as to how you do human rights due diligence in the downstream at Pandora. And in particular, there was one question here about advertising companies and what is your experience of dealing with them? And did you see that there was any knowledge or any due diligence already going on within those service providers? And then maybe one question that you can also address, and that is also relevant to the two other companies, is what type of requirements do you have on customers to implement due diligence as per the UN guiding principles? So please, Johanna.
Sure, thank you so much. I think to the first question I just wrote down here, and again, feel free to ask me follow-up questions if I missed parts of the question here. But I think looking at the different advertising companies that we have, and as I mentioned, the human rights impact assessments was the starting point to understand that there are actually issues in this part, not necessarily issues, but there are potential risks, right? What we're doing right now with the indirect procurement team is to sit down and identify these key to advertising companies and having a dialogue with them. So our standard that we developed will apply to them. So we are right now baking that into our contracts, new, but also existing ones. So first is to make sure that we have a commitment on paper, but then also it's mostly about dialogue. I think that looking out there, and we're trying to gain knowledge from other companies who are B2C, so to say, and it is a complex space. As mentioned before, the online advertising space is quite daunting, to be honest. So we are mapping that as well. And as mentioned, there is a tool that we are looking to, which is about ad placements. And in that tool, we are looking to the opportunity of making in some sort of due diligence mechanism in that. So it's work to be done. Not sure I answered the question on exactly what we are doing, but it's about knowledge, it's about mapping, and it's about integrating our standard in our contracts with our suppliers. And I think maybe to the second question, I think the question was around type of sort of requirements in terms of customers. And when I hear customers, I of course think about our end consumers, but I would trust that the question is maybe more to customers in terms of the partners that we work with. And again, we do have a supplier code of conduct and we have a human rights policy. And obviously those are already baked into all the type of customer or partner contracts that we have. And in that, our responsible marketing practices are mentioned. But again, it's easy enough to have a policy and standards, but it's mostly about engagement and making sure that these practices are implemented. And that is ongoing work, I would say.
Thank you. Maybe turning to you, Caroline, about Novo Nordisk approach to its customers. And I think there's an interesting question here also on, how do you balance out being yourself maybe the supplier of another company, and to what extent can you impose standards or requirements on customers and retailers?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of suppliers, right? And a lot of, we impact a really big chunk of the supply chain. So we're definitely taking a risk-based approach, right? We cannot, do a due diligence in all the suppliers, but we do have a risk management process whereby we sort of risk this suppliers on a red, yellow, green basis, and then if it comes out as a red flag, then we definitely take more of a deeper look into the supplier. So we realize that we cannot yeah, we cannot simply just do a due diligence on all our suppliers down there, upstream, downstream. But what we do anyway is once we do the initial due diligence and we see risks, red flags, and normally we rate our risks according to the region, of course, where we know there's the largest impact of human rights abuses, of course, you know, China and you know, African countries and South American countries. And then if we have a supplier there, then we do the process of doing a DD, and depending on what that comes out, usually then we'll engage with the supplier, right? Obviously, we have contractual provisions to ensure that their clauses are, you know, ESG compliant. We also ensure that we can do capacity building with them, because sometimes it cannot be that just a contractual provision is going to solve the problem. Sometimes we say, hey, let's do a capacity building so that we can also do like a lot of knowledge sharing on how to enhance the transparency around this. Yeah. So we will also ensure that our suppliers are transparent in their own supply chains, and then we put we actually also require them to use traceability documents. For example, if we're going to supply whatever product it is from, let's say, China, we would also require some traceability documents in that contract as well. And then, of course, we also ensure that we have strong KPIs. Yeah. So after the contract has been enforced and the contract is running, you know, we're not just going to sort of let it go until, you know, contract renewal time. We ensure that we catch up with the supplier and we measure the KPI. So if we had put in the contract that the supplier should, for example, provide this traceability documentation, we need to come back 3 months, 6 months down the line and ensure that what we had put in the contract is actually being adhered to, as an example.
Thanks. David, would you like to maybe elaborate a little bit on how your recommendations or requests to your own customers have been received, and maybe, you know, building on the examples you gave, but also maybe more in general, if you want?
Sure. It's not an easy one, because at the end of the day, you know, they're our customers. But I think, and again, it depends the type of customer. So, you know, when you're looking at big traditional retailers, you know, there are joint strategic plans, etc. So, you know, it's a lot easier in order to have a discussion with them and put into contracts with them around, for example, marketing practices and advertisement within store. And as a result, you know, we are able to monitor standards within key stores and then follow up with them in order to take action. When you're looking at sort of modern trade and you're looking at online, that's where it becomes a little more challenging. And if I'm honest, we haven't yet cracked that nut. We have got an agreement in place, certainly within Thailand, with a provider that screens all online e-tailers to ensure adherence to our policy, and where we've identified there are cases of marketing and advertisement that's not in line with our policy, they directly on our behalf follow up with that retailer. So yeah, it's not easy. It's still something we need to crack. I think the nature of the world in which we're moving towards, particularly in the consumer goods space, we're moving from big traditional companies to a lot more fragmented customer base or resellers, and to sort of try to tackle that is somewhat challenging and needs a little more work, I'm thinking.
Thank you, and thanks also for acknowledging that you know, it's not always easy, and I guess, you know, also Johanna, you raised this issue of you know, new ways of selling and online marketing and online sales, which brings its own challenges. I see there's a question here that maybe would be best answered by Ben and Gabrielle around is there any legal responsibility towards due diligence in the downstream towards your customers? What do we see? You know, you mentioned, Ben, a few legal cases at the beginning, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what we're seeing. What is the emerging space there?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. And preface this by saying that the legal landscape here is evolving, and we'll certainly have to pay attention to the debate in relation to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive at the European Union level. But one thing I think is interesting, and we highlight in our report, is that there is already this, if you like, I think it's been termed by other commentators as regulation through litigation. We see cases coming up which really, touch on these downstream contexts and issues. Be that from the sale of assets, an interesting case in the UK around a ship that was sent to be scrapped, or be it in relation to the misuse of products and services. So what I would say is, even though the legislation may not be there on this issue, there's already questions of legal liability that are fairly advanced. Gabrielle may have some additional comments to make.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben. I just sort of echo your remarks there and note that, of course, the legal space at the EU level is certainly evolving. We don't yet know exactly what form the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive will take, but certainly this issue around whether the due diligence obligations will extend across the full value chain is very much live in the negotiations at the moment. And I think one of the things that we were hoping to achieve through this presentation of case studies is to provide a bit more of an evidence base for those policy discussions, to sort of show that companies are in fact already doing a form of due diligence in this part of the value chain. And these are practices that should very much be encouraged and perhaps not stamped out by a more conservative approach to regulation in this area. But of course, I mean, we're talking a lot about the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and its potential to extend to downstream impacts. But there are, of course, regulations that exist outside of that, which do regulate in various respects parts of the downstream. We're looking at, consumer protection, product safety laws. So it's not as though this is a space that is unregulated at the moment, but there isn't a focus on the human rights impacts of these parts of the value chain. And so I think that's the necessary evolution here. But of course, as Ben says, no company is insulated completely from legal risk. It may be more challenging to litigate these issues. But of course, there are examples of cases that are being brought in various jurisdictions which concern this part of the value chain. So I think that, again, that's another driver for action here. I think that addresses the question, but I'll hand back to you, Elin.
Yes, thank you. And indeed, very interesting, as you said, Ben, it's not only about what the sort of current legislation is requiring or where the CSD will include downstream due diligence, but it's also about, many other legal areas and litigation creativity that will also make the case for why companies need to do this. And before sort of wrapping up the seminar, I'd like to maybe invite all of the speakers, if they have any sort of final remarks or anything you'd like to share with participants before we close. We have a couple of minutes still. There's a very long question in the chat, so while you speak, I will be reading that one. So who wants to maybe give some final remarks?
Can maybe kick off. I think that, hearing both David and Caroline speak here today, and also the rest of you guys here on the screen, I just think it recognizes that we all work in different areas of the business. They're all intertwined with human rights. It seems very much like, right? I think looking at this from just a learning experience as well, it's about dialogue. And so I think that's what I bring with me here today. And I think, yeah. And also looking at, it doesn't really matter where in the supply chain you're looking, where the practices are intertwined, right? So yeah, that was just a top of mind sort of reflection of today's discussions. But I don't know, Caroline, David, if you have anything.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you again. Of course, I think that even as the legislation provides, right, we have to take a risk-based approach. I think if you want to do it all, you will not be able to do it all, right? You need to take a risk-based approach, and then you have to have the tone from the top, right? So if you have your senior leaders in the company that put this on the agenda, and this is something that the company is going to do, then it's going to be quite possible, and the work is going to be quite easy to do, I think, at least from the experience that I have here at Novo Nordisk. So it's very much a risk-based approach, very much with the mandate from from the company leadership that this is a process we need to abide by. We abide by the UNGPs. We need to be ready for the directive when it comes into enforcement. We are even ready now with the Norwegian Transparency Act, with the German Supply Chain DD Act. Yeah, we just need to ensure that we are on top of it.
Thank you, Caroline. David.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I think from my perspective, if we break it up into two bits in terms of the downstream, the risk and then the opportunity. I think from a risk perspective, begin building on what Joanna has mentioned. Already, so many functions within our business are monitoring the downstream impacts of our brands on consumers. Be it the medical safety adverse events team, be it our quality team and consumer relations. So I think there is an opportunity for us to really embed that human rights lens into those existing practices to scale the visibility we have around impacts in the downstream. And then the second thing is around the opportunity. I know the UNGPs is all centered around mitigating impact, negative impact. But again, I truly believe businesses can be a force for good. And given the nature of a company's goods or services, there will be an element of their business or their service or solution that can have a positive impact. So I think in addition to risk, identify what that is, see how you can really drive and promote specific human rights through your business and brands, because that is a really good way to really engage the wider business around the wider positive impact you can have.
Many thanks, and thank you really for all of you for speaking up and showing what you're doing, including the challenges. I think maybe a few takeaway points that could be interesting is to reflect further on is maybe the similarities between conducting human rights due diligence in the downstream and the upstream. All of you highlighted that it is about knowing your business, knowing your risks, knowing your business partners, and that is not unsimilar to what you need to do when it comes to the supply chain. And of course, you will have a level of complexity that is different depending on what kind of company you are. And I really also invite you to look at the other case studies that are included in the short publication. Because it's not only about consumer-facing companies, it is also about those that do not necessarily have such, a sort of recognizable brand as the three companies that we had today. I think another thing that all of you highlighted, which I think is also interesting to note, is this will involve different functions within the companies, and some of these functions that maybe are not that familiar yet with human rights, sales, marketing, distribution. So, it's time that we do start these conversations also within the people that are not only in procurement functions, and that's going to be obviously a challenge. I also get, and this is of course a very short and limited space, but there is a lot to learn from each other, and I think both GBI and ourselves are interested to be facilitating this kind of dialogue. So I would really also invite the other companies that are attending today to just reach out and be part of a discussion. This is really an emerging space. And finally, I think one of the things that you also all highlighted, whether we like it or not, there will be in some way or another some expectations and maybe some legal requirements that will be increasing on companies. So we need to be ready, and I think we also keen to help those companies to sort of understand and navigate this space. It is quite complex, as you said, but it will be evolving in the years to come. So with that, I would just like to extend thanks to all of you and for attending. Thanks to all the participants. Please do not hesitate to reach out with questions and comments, and certainly the conversation will continue offline and online. So thanks to all, and in particular to GBI for sharing this space with the Institute. Thank you and have a good day, everyone.